I will kick off the webinar today. So my name is Leah Marie Lucas. I'm the research manager at the U.S. Overseas Cooperative Development Council International Cooperative Research Group, so OCDC ICRG. And I'm really pleased to kick off the ICRG's June series called Cooperative Resilience, a dialogue based on recent research. This dialogue builds on the Cooperative Research for Cooperative Resilience research program, which we launched in June of 2020. We look forward to coming together over the month of June, 2 more times beyond today, to discuss the key research findings with our research partners, including global communities, Cusco, ICA Africa, the Cooperative University of Kenya, NCBA CLUSA, Venture37 Land O'Lakes, and Genex. But before diving in, I would like to invite the visionary behind this program, Dr. Judith Hermanson, the director of the International Cooperative Research Group, to say a few words. Dr. Hermanson, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Leah. And I just want to say a few words of warm welcome to each of you. We're really delighted that you are here. And we also thank so much all of the research partners that have contributed to this innovative way of looking at cooperative resilience. All the work is field research based, and as I would like just to say that the ICRG is focused on finding ways through evidence that can help cooperatives be more effective and impactful for their members and their communities. So I do hope that you learned today from things that will be practically useful to you, as well as new insights into resilience. Resilience on all levels is more important than ever in this current world that we live in. So thank you again, and I hope that not only will you be with us today, but you'll join for the other 2 sessions that Leah mentioned. Thank you again.
Thank you, Dr. Hermanson. Now for a few housekeeping remarks. We will have 1 hour together today. We thank you very much for being here. We thank you for your time. And we've reserved 20 minutes for questions and answers from the audience at the end of the dialogue today. So please feel free throughout the conversation to pose your questions for the panelists through this Q&A function. And we will then go through the list of questions and read them aloud, engaging with the audience at the close. At that point, if you would prefer to verbally voice your question to the panelists, this is very much encouraged. You can simply raise your hand and my colleague, Dr. Fitzgerald, will allow you to voice your question to the panelists. So without further ado, we're ready to kick off. Part 1. Part 1 of the series brings together 2 of our research partners, ICA Africa and the combined project with Venture37 and Genex, to discuss the resilience-oriented findings from their CR2 research into 2 key agricultural value chains in East Africa, coffee and dairy. Today's conversation will focus on the research findings related to resilience in the face of both supply chain disruptions and climate shocks. On behalf of Venture37 and Genex, today we are joined by Dr. Anna Snyder. Dr. Anna Snyder is an international agricultural development specialist at the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign. She is a multidisciplinary social scientist and program manager who uses qualitative and mixed methods from sociology, management, and economics. Dr. Snyder has worked across world regions to improve support livelihoods. Dr. Snyder, thank you for being here. On behalf of ICA Africa, we are joined today by Dr. Rose Karimi. Dr. Karimi is Program Manager for ICA Africa under the ICA EU Partnership on Cooperatives in Development, People-Centered Businesses in Action. She has a PhD in Supply Chain Management from Rutgers State University and an MBA in Project Management from the University of Nairobi. Dr. Karimi, we're so happy to have you here. Beginning with you, Dr. Karimi. Your study aimed to identify how climate-smart agriculture is impacting the production system in East Africa, specifically looking at how climate change is first impacting the nature of coffee production and the yields across the region. Your study was titled, adoption of climate-smart agricultural practices that contribute to the resilience of small-scale farmers, incentives, barriers, and lessons learned from coffee cooperatives in East Africa. Please share with the audience what led you to this research topic.
Thank you, Leah, and good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Well, we are mostly aware that climate change has become a significant risk to our fight against poverty and sustainable livelihoods. Now, the impact of climate change on agricultural productivity and sustainability can be seen. Actually, my grandmother back in the village these days does not know when the rains are supposed to come. She knew before that on March 15th, the rains are expected and she could prepare her farm for planting. And on October 15th, those are the two seasons. These days, she does not know that anymore. Why? Because of the variability in the rainfall patterns. Well, according to the International Coffee Organization, coffee is among the crops that have been greatly impacted by climate change. One of the impact is the rising temperatures, especially in East African region. Even half a degree increase in temperatures has got an impact, not only on the flavor, but also the aroma and quality of coffee. Now, coffee being one of the most traded commodities in the world, there are many families, especially the small-scale farmers, who make 60% of the producers of coffee grown in developing countries depend on it. Therefore, in Africa, around 10 million farmers, mostly small-scale farmers, across 25 countries depend on coffee, not only for the revenue, but also for employment. Coffee being grown on farms means it's a source of employment in rural areas. Now, it's for this simple reason that we decided to focus on this very important crop that is impacted by climate change. Also, you'd ask why East Africa? East Africa, because East Africa is a source of very fine coffees in the world, the specialty coffees. And another reason is because the countries of Uganda, Tanzania, Kenya, Ethiopia, and Rwanda produce around 80% of the coffees grown in the Africa region. I would say that was the single most reason why we focused on this important crop or topic. And why cooperatives? Because the small-scale coffee farmers are organized into cooperatives for their coffee production and marketing. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Dr. Karimi. It's great to hear you have both that personal and professional connection to coffee and coffee supply chain. So really impactful choice. Dr. Snyder, your study attempted to answer this million-dollar question of what difference the cooperative model makes by positing cooperative dairy enterprises with non-cooperative dairy enterprises in Rwanda and Kenya. Through this cross-comparative study, you sought to identify how the different business models responded and coped to the COVID-19 and supply chain crisis. Your study was titled Organizational Resilience in Rwanda and Kenya's Dairy Sectors, a comparative case study of business responses to the COVID-19 crisis. Please share what inspired the design and the topic of this study.
Thanks, Leah. The topic of this study came about because of the interest of the partners. Venture37 and Genex both have cooperative development programs in several countries and had seen the effects of COVID-19 on the cooperatives. And so we're interested in how this was a deeper understanding of how this was affecting the cooperatives, and also looking at the different coping mechanisms that a private firm may have, seeing what we can learn from private firms or conventional firms, and seeing if there are any lessons that we can translate into cooperatives to get to resilience. And Venture37 had previously done a quantitative study on the impact of COVID-19 on cooperatives, and had participants from cooperative development programs in several countries. But we were looking for something more qualitative to give a bit more context to the answers that they had gotten from that study, and also to look at a little bit farther into the pandemic. We did this fieldwork in October 2021. And so not at the depths or the heights of the pandemic, however you want to think about it, but you know, after there had been a little bit of recovery, to see how this effect had progressed over time. And so we looked at cooperative resilience in terms of how cooperatives and conventional firms adapt, respond, and innovate at a time of crisis without engaging in extended regressive behavior.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Really fascinating to also understand that even the time period of data collection was intentionally designed. So really interesting introduction. So back to you, Dr. Karimi. We understand that you have this very large question on the table with climate change, coffee production, and the importance of this crop to the economies in East Africa. So I'm wondering what you had hypothesized going into this research project, if anything, and in what way did the findings correspond to that hypothesis? What did you learn that was surprising to you?
Thank you, Leah. First, I'll start by giving you we set out to identify what climate-smart agricultural practices could contribute to the resilience of the coffee cooperatives in East Africa by focusing on 5 specific objectives. That is to identify what climate-smart agricultural practices are likely to impact the coffee production, identify the practices available to the coffee cooperatives, then what are the incentives for the adoption of the climate-smart agricultural practices, then what are the barriers to the adoption of climate-smart agricultural practices, and finally recommend an enabling policy environment for the coffee cooperatives. Well, from the study, it was clear that climate change was actually posing a great threat to the coffee farmers, the larger sector, and the national economies. The overall effect was decreased or declining coffee production quality, as well as the impact on the impact brought about by variability in temperatures, rising temperatures, changing seasonality, the changing rainfall, increased pests and diseases, among others. Now, when it comes to what we found surprising, one of the things we found was that much as all the respondents I indicated that they had been involved in some form of climate-smart agricultural practices at their farm level. This was at 96.7%. At the processing level, that is where all the cooperatives process, the involvement was not so much. It was only at that 6.7%. Another thing I found surprising, or we found surprising, was the fact that we expected, because we were talking about the changing rainfall patterns, perhaps the farmers to have adopted simple techniques such as irrigation, but this was not the case. Looking at the representation of the coffee cooperatives that we looked at, that were 30 of them across the 5 countries, this represents around 68,000 coffee farmers. Then only 6.7% of them indicated that they had adopted some kind of irrigation systems on their farm. Another surprising thing is that among the 5 countries, they all have some strategy or some policy guidelines on climate change agricultural practices. However, the coffee cooperative leaders are not aware of such guidelines that are specific to the coffee sector. So we could say that this is what we found a bit surprising. The policies are there, but where they're supposed to be implemented or the people supposed to be benefiting from them are actually not aware that they do exist, if any. So I would say those were some of the surprising things. The other things that our study found out was the adoption barriers, which I think are important to note. The sociocultural barriers, we have things like the aging farmers. On average, the coffee farmer is 55 years old. So the young generation do not seem interested in coffee farming. Perhaps coffee is it takes long to get the gains, and perhaps there are other more exciting ventures in the agricultural sector or elsewhere that the young population could be interested in. Another thing that we found was the gender issue, that women, though interested or willing to adopt the climate smart agricultural practices on their farms, many are not decision makers on their farm. The men own the land, so they may not adopt it because they are not actually able to make the decision as to how to use or what to implement on their farm. Another perception issue or sociocultural issue we found was the lack of trust in new coffee varieties that could withstand the climate change, and also the perception that climate smart agricultural practices are expensive. And so the farmers are not willing. Although the economic factors then are things like the lack of technical know-how, the lack of funds, because adopting some of the practices other than the low-cost, simple things like soil conservation or conservation agriculture, then the lack of funds came in, and people cited that as one of the key barriers. And also the lack of knowledge on what climate smart agricultural practices are available for them to use. I would say these were some of the barriers that were cited. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Karimi. Really interesting and even some surprising findings that you mentioned with those percentages in the beginning. So I'd like to pose the same question to you, Dr. Snyder. Looking at this very interesting topic of study, looking at cooperative model versus traditional or non-cooperative business models, what type of hypotheses did you have coming into the study? How did the study findings respond to these hypotheses? And what did you find to be rather surprising or just unexpected to your research team?
Well, we did expect to find that there were some different coping mechanisms and responses between conventional firms and cooperatives. And we did find this to some extent. What we found was that, of course, the pandemic was a big shock to both conventional and cooperative businesses. Both were a bit slow to respond. And as we looked not just at response and adaptation, but also we wanted to specify innovation as something that was forward-looking and really a structural change in the organization. We really found very little of that in either type of organization. Most things were pretty much reactions to the situation and figuring out a short-term answer to deal with that. There were no crisis preparedness plans either in private firms or in cooperatives, and it was really difficult to get people to think about crisis preparedness beyond just a savings account that they could draw from if something like this happened again. Anything about structural changes or structural plans on operations was really a foreign concept to them. And so as far as the differences in response, we did find, and this was pretty much expected, that the conventional firms responded by decreasing the decreased demand for product, by laying off their workers, reducing the hours of their workers, in some cases asking workers to work for half salary. And the cooperatives were more likely, in fact, 100% in Rwanda, were more likely to keep all of their staff on at full time and full pay. And some of this was due to the cooperative development program. They said Venture37 taught us how to treat our employees well, and so we support them through this. But what we did find that was a little surprising was that even though the conventional firms had responded by cutting costs, cutting salaries, some sort of logical steps to respond to the pandemic, when we look at the business indicators, as far as volume of sales per day and volume of products sold, we see less recovery than we see from the cooperatives. So even though the cooperatives kept all of their staff on throughout the pandemic, they were responding, they were recovering a bit more quickly. And what we found is that there's a real interconnectedness between the cooperatives and the conventional firms. Because the private firms are the ones offering veterinary services, AI services, fodder, support to smallholder farmers. They cut a lot of these services. The farmers at first had a lot of milk to sell, and then as they weren't able to access some of these services, they divested out of livestock farming. And once the recovery started to happen, once the market came back for dairy products, they weren't able to increase their production to respond because they had sold their cattle. Their cattle had died because of lack of veterinary services. They weren't investing in feeding their cattle well. So that was part that was a bit unexpected for us.
That's fascinating, and something that I think so many industries have had to go through during this period of time. At the height of the pandemic, at the height of the crisis, there was really this desire to save costs, to save the business viability, and that might mean cutting large numbers of staff, large amounts of their kind of operational capacity. But then at the time that now industries are beginning to open back up, those same companies that made such drastic cuts are now struggling to really be able to get the human resources back on board to deliver. So that's quite interesting how that cooperative model and the cooperative spirit of treating the workers well and keeping them on somehow also corresponded to positive productivity and positive rebound, let's say, in terms of production. So that's quite interesting. Thank you. So back to you, Dr. Karimi, and I'd like to dig in a bit to coffee. And so we've heard a bit about coffee. Many of us are coffee fans, and so coffee is a part of our days and our morning routines. It would be helpful to understand what is unique about coffee as a crop. Coffee has a lot of peculiarities in terms of the geography that is adequate for good production, in terms of altitude and rainfall. And so, as you mentioned, just a slight change in temperature really can have a huge change in the taste and the price and the production of coffee. And so I'd like to hear what is specific and what is unique about coffee. For example, looking at climate smart agricultural practices in coffee, instead of looking at any other value chain. We understand that cereal crops are in crisis in Africa right now. There are many different value chains that could have been considered. And so maybe you can just highlight how climate smart agricultural practices specifically impact coffee and why you chose coffee as a value chain as this sort of really important area of study.
Thank you again, Leah. I think I look at coffee as a crop that is impacted by climate change, as well as its production contributes much to climate change. So it's like a double-edged sword, because when the coffee is produced, especially I say the East African coffees are quality because they are washed coffees. They require a lot of water for their processing. Now, this washing, the water that is washed is discarded to the environment. That pollutant is a methane emitting process. And so you are actually seeing that processing itself is bringing back the greenhouse gas emissions back to the environment. Well, as if that is not enough, when the coffee prices, because coffee is a commodity traded on the world market, when the prices become low, then the farmers tend to perhaps increase the area of production. So it will require perhaps deforestation so that you can increase your piece of land, so that you have more coffee, so that you can get more money from the coffee. So again, that's why I said its production could also be causing a negative impact on the environment. So when you're practicing climate smart agriculture, you're not only assisting sustainable coffee production, you're also assisting the entire coffee supply chain, because once the impact of climate change impacts on the productivity, it means we shall have less coffee production. Once we have less coffee, the coffee consumer will still require, the demand will still be high, and that means the cost can also be passed on to the customer when we look at the effects of supply and demand. So again, that's why we thought that coffee could really be an important crop to look at, so that we can sustainably produce it, sustainably process it, sustainably also distribute it, because transportation of coffee is also has got an impact on our environment. So it's both. It can be affected, and it also affects both in its production and in its processing. That's what I would say. I don't know whether I've answered the question.
Yes, you
Also,
have.
you can have other crops that are also along the same, especially the crops such as cash crops, something like tea. They require, perhaps if they have no electricity, to cut down a number of trees so they can provide firewood to cure the tea when they are in the processing. Cocoa will also require them to perhaps increase their land by planting more cocoa if the prices are not favorable. So again, trying to increase the production other than improving the productivity of the area that you already have, I think has got an impact on the climate. So it depends on the crop and the context. But coffee, given that there are so many economies depending on it, especially in developing countries, and also so many consumers depending on it, I think I would say it's unique.
Yes, that's a really great response, and also quite interesting to hear a bit more about that processing, and that the washing process is requiring a lot of water, creating methane. And then if I remember the percentages correctly from the beginning, there was quite a low percent of cooperatives that were actually adopting climate smart agricultural practices in the processing component of the production. So it seems there may be some potential there, but I won't jump to the findings yet. So back to Dr. Snyder for a very similar question. So understanding dairy as a very unique value chain, a value chain that requires quite sophisticated systems of cold storage, of transportation, and really logistics for a robust supply chain. It would be helpful to hear a bit more about how the dairy sector and how the dairy cooperatives are structured, and whether you think that the findings that you have resulted in your study on dairy could have any type of comparative potentials to other value chains. I don't know, looking at cold meats or horticulture, for example. So over to you.
Right. I think you hit on the most important part, is the perishable nature of dairy products. And the cow needs to be milked every day, whether there's a market for the milk or not. And so from the quantitative study that Venture37 had conducted earlier, we did find that it covered different types of cooperatives, and we did find that dairy cooperatives were some of the first to be impacted by the pandemic, just because of this, because it's not so seasonal. It's not like maize or something like that with a harvest season. The members of the cooperative are collecting milk every day, and the cooperatives are generally small and have limited capacity to cool the milk, and so they have to pass it on to a dairy and move it out quite quickly. Some interesting differences that we found was that in Rwanda there's just lower consumption of dairy products locally, and so a lot of the market for their dairy was for the tourism industry, the hotels, restaurants, and things like that in the capital. Whereas in Kenya, there is a higher consumption of dairy within the homes. And so we found two different responses in the two countries. First of all, in Rwanda, once the hotels and restaurants closed, there was very little demand for milk. And so the cooperatives and the smallholders had all of this milk on their hands that they weren't able to sell. It was pretty much the opposite situation in Kenya, where because the schools were closed, the children were home from school, and so the smallholders who were normally selling a lot of milk kept that milk for their own consumption for the kids who were at home. And so it was really a demand problem on the side of Rwanda, where it was a supply problem on the side of Kenya. And I would say something else that makes the value chain more specific to dairy is that in the context that we were studying, there wasn't a lot of overlap of services. There were the dairy cooperatives that collected the milk, but in general did very little processing themselves. They offered maybe some veterinary services or AI services, but in general, that was a service provided by the private sector. And so that's why we saw this interconnectedness of the cooperatives and the private firms. If it was a different context where there's both private firms and cooperatives offering the same services, maybe we wouldn't have seen that. But I think that there is some lessons that can be learned from value chains like horticulture that are very perishable, are dependent on the supply chain, and really need to be harvested at a certain time, as well as anything that caters to, there are a lot of findings that we found just about the dynamics of smallholder cooperatives that I think are relevant to many different value chains.
Thank you so much. That's a great response. And you touched upon one of the most interesting points of the study from my read was really the interconnected nature of the cooperative dairy firms and the non-cooperative enterprises. And so it really leads to this interdependence. So, a shock by one or a resilience by one somehow does impact the other partner player as well. So that is a great nugget for us to take forward. So back to you, Dr. Karimi. I'd like to hear a bit about the cross-country study that you conducted. And so did you find, understanding that of course you were studying at a macro level across the region of East Africa, but did you find any differences or any peculiarities based on the operating environment, either the political environment, perhaps the geographic environment, even the climatic shocks or climatic situation that the farmers had dealt with? So really I'm asking for any changes, any unique traits of the countries that were included in this study.
Thank you again, Leah. I think the East African countries, the 5 of them, Rwanda, Kenya, Uganda, Tanzania, and Ethiopia, are basically similar in the guidelines or the policies that the government has in place for climate smart agricultural practice. Each of them actually adds something. For example, in Tanzania, there was the climate smart agricultural guideline. Uganda has its own climate smart agricultural country program. Kenya has its own climate. So they are all having climate smart agricultural guidelines or policies or strategies, which all focus on resilience or enhanced resilience, increased productivity, and reduced emission. However, when what we found also similar were things like when farmers cite their incentive, or what's their incentive to adopt the climate smart agriculture, they are all interested in increased production of their crops and of course increased incomes. The barriers were also similar. Now, what we found different was perhaps at the processing level, either perhaps because there are much as the governments have the policies or their strategies on paper, the same has not been enforced, because like it's only in Rwanda, I think that's why we found the percentage of the processing level low, that you find some cooperative is doing some kind of wastewater management from the washing of their coffees. Even some, perhaps the issue could be the cost, because these particular cooperatives and worked together with some development partners who are helping them to access the niche markets for the specialty coffees. So it has to be seen that you're producing your coffee sustainably. And I think that's the difference we see, because then in the other countries, no such thing like wastewater management system exists, or they do not even recycle or even treat that wastewater before it is released back to the streams, because you realize most of the coffee washing stations are located near some streams for the source of water to be close by. And when they don't do that, then they are emitting the pollutants to the streams, and so affecting the community, hence not practicing principle number 7, for concern for the community. So I think that's a major difference we found. Another one could be perhaps the market has been organized. Different countries have their own market organization of the coffee is traded. There are those that have got a coffee exchange, and others, the buyers directly deal with the farmers. So perhaps if a buyer is keen on sustainable coffees, then they would want to see the coffee cooperative adopting the sustainable practices, both at the farm and also at the processing level. That's what I would say. But if it's at the coffee exchange, then the buyer has no contact with the producer, so they just buy what they find at the coffee exchange. And so you find then there will be no incentive for the coffee cooperatives or farmers even to be aware that such kind of sustainable coffee is required in the market.
Thank you, Dr. Karimi. And that's a very interesting and insightful, somehow non-surprising point, that the incentives for the farmers to engage and implement climate smart agricultural practices is really for them to increase their incomes. And so I think that that's a salient point for us to keep in mind as we are implementing and designing programs with smallholders, is that the bottom line really, really matters. So we've now reached the end of our moderated conversation, and it's been really fascinating. I thank you both for your responses. I'd like to transition now to the question and answers with the audience. And so this is the time that we will begin to entertain these questions. Of course, we will continue to dialogue amongst ourselves if the questions are not sufficient, but I see we already have one in the waiting. And so it comes from Alex Dunkel with ACDI VOCA. And Alex wants to pose a question to Dr. Snyder. Dr. Snyder, did you find any connections with saving groups such as village savings and lendings associations playing a role during or after the crisis to provide any assistance to cooperative members?
Yes, thanks for the question. There was some mention of people participating in village savings and loans, and how they contributed, but of course a lot of the payments from the cooperatives the farmers had not been paid when they weren't delivering milk to the cooperative, and so it did become difficult to contribute to some of those. But yes, there was some mention, but there was also, they weren't so much associated with the cooperatives, and so there was some mention that this would be a good service that the cooperative could provide us, is to help us save, to have some sort of savings account, whether it's as a VSLA or as a different type of mechanism to help them save for crises like that.
Great, thank you so much. And back to the audience then for additional questions. Please feel free to raise your hand if you'd like, using the raise hand function. You can unmute yourself and ask your question, or use the Q&A function as you wish. So I'll give the audience one chance now if they'd like to raise their hand before kicking off the next question. Great, I see we have one hand raised. So I think that we can invite Willie from Venture37, Rwanda, to pose your question. Go ahead, Willie.
Yeah. Thank you, Leah. My name is Willie Nyirigira from London, Venture37 from London. As the climate issues, environment protection, cooperative development.
I'm sorry to interrupt, Willie. Sorry to interrupt, but we're not getting the audio clearly. So if you don't mind writing out your question, and we can maybe try again in a few moments' time.
Sure.
Okay, great. So I'll go to the next question then from Caroline Bailey, again with ACDI VOCA. Thank you for your questions. So this question is related to gender and resilience. And so this will be a question for both of our panelists. You know, what did you find related to gender specifically in this study? Even if it was not the core research question, certainly you may have gleaned some insights. So please do feel free to kick us off, Dr. Karimi, and then we'll go to Dr. Snyder.
Thank you for that question. As I cited earlier, we earned a gender issue as part of a socio-cultural barrier to adoption of climate change. However, it was also noted that by some respondents that women are more willing to implement climate smart agricultural practice such as intercropping, where in your coffee farm, then you plant something like bananas. For instance, that could be because women are also concerned about their food security. I mean, food for their families. So when I intercrop my coffee or the coffee with bananas, then I can actually diversify my source of food before the family waits for the coffee income to come. I mean, because after selling your coffee, especially in some countries like Kenya, then you have to wait for it to be sold before you get some money. Unlike other countries where the buyers are directly buying the coffee from the farmers. So if I have food for my family, then I would be more than willing to intercrop my coffee farm with something like either fruit trees or bananas as food for the family. So there will be food security and also nutrition for the family. So maybe that's an agenda issue I can cite that we found out.
Thank you, Dr. Karimi, and over to you, Dr. Snyder.
Thanks. Yes, that's an interesting question and very in line with my research interests as well. And as we mentioned, it wasn't really part of the overall research questions, but just like Dr. Karimi found, I think one thing that we noticed was that the women were the very few examples that we found of innovative behavior was from women. Not necessarily women who were part of the cooperative, but women that were looking at this crisis and saying, how can I protect myself in the future, or what opportunities are there? There were examples of milk sellers that had purchased some land to grow some horticultural crops, just to sort of diversify themselves a bit out of livestock. There was one entrepreneurial woman who wasn't, before the pandemic, was not a milk collector, and said she saw a niche that people weren't testing the quality of milk before they collected it, and then people were surprised if their milk was rejected later on. And so she started a business by testing the quality of milk at the collection site, and offered that service to members. So just a couple of examples of how we found that women had more of an innovative look at a crisis.
Great, thank you so much for your comments. And one follow-on question on gender. Sometimes we see a situation where men are more present in the farmer training. So for example, trainings on innovation or practices, and perhaps slightly less present in some of the daily labor of the agricultural farm. So I'm not sure if this was within the scope of your study, but Dr. Karimi, it seems that there is a bit of training needed to implement climate smart agricultural practices. Did you glean any insights on who's attending those trainings, who's offering them, and how that impacts the actual implementation of the improved agriculture?
In the responses that we got, is actually the training is carried out at the cooperative level. They are like sensitized on the importance of mulching their coffee farms, practicing conservation agriculture, but this is done at the cooperative level, where some cooperatives even have some farmer field schools where the members get to learn. So I guess that training can also happen at the same level, because I think the fact that the farmers are organized into a cooperative, then it's easier to disseminate and to transfer such kind of knowledge to the members.
Okay, that's great to know that, yes, the cooperative is this gender inclusive and equalizing force. So great to hear. And one more question for you then from Willie, Dr. Karimi. So from the study findings, would you recommend that we integrate climate smart agricultural practices in cooperative law or in the cooperative's internal rules. And so particularly looking at agricultural cooperatives.
Thank you, Willie, for that question, because I think from what I said before that these climate smart agricultural policies and guidelines exist at the country level, but then you find that the members, the cooperative members, even their leaders are not aware of the specific policies that pertain to different crops. So perhaps for agricultural cooperatives, it would be important to continue building the capacity of their members by either incorporating them in their internal rules or in their bylaws if they are agricultural cooperatives, so that then this can form part of their education, training, and information. Because without information, we say information is power, then the members will not be able to implement what they do not know. So then that continuous capacity building should be encouraged. So I don't know in terms of whether to put it in the cooperative law, because I think when it comes to the cooperative law, it may not be very specific whether you're a financial organization or an agricultural or a housing cooperative. Perhaps in the internal rules that can work. Or some were actually talking about these being part of the performance contracting for even government agricultural officers that will then be asked to implement these policies at the farm, at the cooperative levels or the farm levels. And others were also talking about cooperatives to have agronomists that should actually tell them about these practices. So yes, I think that's a great suggestion, and I think it should be encouraged in all cooperative development matters, because once they do this, it's for their good. It's a win-win. Win for the farmer, win for the cooperative, win for the country, win for the environment, and win for everyone along the chain. I hope I've answered your question.
That's wonderful. And we'd invite Willie as well. If you'd like Willie to try to unmute yourself again if you have a further question or response, you're welcome to do so now, and we'll wait and see if we can hear well.
Yeah, thank you, Leah. I think one of my questions was that Dr. Ross just answered. If you can hear me well now, and I had another comment echoing what Anna had said around the competitivity of the value chains. And I was saying that the dairy sector was one of the most hit in the market. So the research is a good indicator, even other cooperatives in other industries, except the ones focusing on export, because export was in a way paused. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much, Willie. And just a note to all of the attendees that you have just about 7 minutes left. So if you would like to raise your hand and be a part of the conversation, please do feel free to do so. And I'm seeing that we have one more question. So again, from Alex Dunkel, thank you. And so for both panelists, looking at the Kenyan context, are cooperatives linked together under larger federations? And if so, did these federations take any actions to support their members during the crisis? So I hope I've gotten the question correctly, and over to the panelists.
Yes, that was one difference between Rwanda and Kenya, that the cooperatives were more vertically structured in Kenya. And in Rwanda, even if the cooperative unions existed, they didn't offer as much support to the first tier cooperatives. And so there was some examples in Kenya of some support as far as training to the first tier cooperatives.
Great. Well, thank you. Dr. Karimi, would you like to add something from Kenya?
maybe not from our research, because we didn't look at the COVID crisis. However, I think just from what Dr. Snyder has said, when a cooperative structure in the country is well organized, then even that information flow and whatever the cooperatives organized in the country, then it's well aligned. So during the COVID crisis, the cooperatives or the federations were actually at the forefront in raising funding and also advocating for different cooperative sectors to be assisted in different ways, especially the cooperative members who have got loans, then to either be given some grace period, because during the period of the COVID, then perhaps their business is not going on. So such kind of things are then advocated for by the federations. So I think the federations really assist their members.
Wonderful. That's a really helpful question, because it brings us then to the sort of policy recommendations. And so I think it's quite fitting to end on this note. So perhaps just a brief, maybe 2-minute response on how these research findings impact policy. And so this policy implication point was a really key part of the research question in the case of the ICA Africa study. And certainly there are some insights that the Venture37 and Genex study has also gathered in terms of policy. And so feel free to give a brief response now to the recommendations that your teams have come up with.
Is that? Well, we came up with some recommendations for policy, and a key one, given the lack of funds that was cited by the respondents, was whether the cost of adopting or the cost of these climate smart agricultural practices could be subsidized, even at the government level. We saw how there's very little irrigation taking place. So if some kind of such equipment could be subsidized, perhaps the farmers can afford them, given that they mentioned the volatility of prices impacts on their ability to adopt these climate smart agricultural practices, because the immediate need for them is food and also the agricultural inputs. Then also a lot of sensitization and awareness creation among the coffee cooperatives and their members about the climate smart agricultural policies available, and also practices that can enhance their resilience, especially at the processing level. Then there is continuous capacity building required, both by the cooperative and the extension workers for the government, and also participation of the cooperative themselves in drafting these relevant climate smart agricultural practices, especially those pertaining to the coffee sector, and the implementation of innovative farming practices, such as contract farming when it comes to marketing of the crops like coffee that are impacted by price volatility, and a lot of research and extension on these climate smart agricultural practices, so that we can have some evidence-based decision making, both at the government level and also by the cooperatives themselves. I think those are the key recommendations that we will suggest.
Great, thank you so much. And one final question has come in while we were discussing, and so please do feel free, Dr. Snyder, to take either question, either the original posed question or this question from Rwanda. Any specific training gaps in the cooperatives that should be addressed? So over to you for the final response. Thank you.
Thanks. Yes, just briefly, I think this sort of covers both questions. We had recommendations for all of the stakeholders to promote the domestic consumption of dairy, because to give a bit more resilience to the industry, but also to achieve some of the nutrition goals that governments and NGOs and other sectors have. For governments, for funders, definitely some training on crisis preparedness, writing a crisis preparedness plan, things like that, and for co-ops, we want to encourage them to avoid mission drift, and because the crisis of the pandemic sort of uncovered some inconsistencies and some exacerbated some other crises that they had. And for conventional firms to continue to support smallholder farmers because their resilience is so tightly intertwined that by supporting the smallholder farmer during a crisis, they can then recover more quickly when the situation normalizes.
Wonderful. Thank you so much to both of our panelists for this really interesting dialogue, to our audience members for being a part of it, for adding your insights and questions. And thanks to everyone for being here. It's been a great kickoff to this series. We hope that you'll come back for part 2 and part 3, and continue to stay tuned for the further dissemination of this research program. So thank you, everyone. And without further ado, please go on and have a great rest of your days.